The scissors made a sound no one should ever hear in a classroom. Snip. An 11-year-old girl sat frozen at her desk as her teacher smiled and cut her hair in front of everyone. No warning. No permission. Just power. Phones shook. Kids gasped. And the girl didn't cry. The teacher laughed and said, "Now you look presentable." What she didn't know was that someone was watching from the hallway. A man in a tailored suit. Hands raised, eyes wide. That was her father. And this wasn't a poor, helpless parent begging the system. This was a man powerful enough to make institutions disappear. But here's the part that will disturb you most. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't call a lawyer. He stayed silent. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the warning. And by the time the school realized who they had crossed, it was already too late. Backhand index pointing right was the teacher disciplined or destroyed. Backhand index pointing right would you have stayed silent or fought back immediately. Watch till the end, because the quiet ones always hit hardest. The scissors made a soft metallic sound, barely louder than the ticking clock above the chalkboard. It was the kind of sound most people missed. A small sound, an ordinary sound. The sort that blended into the hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of children settling into their seats. But Joanna Thomas heard it. She heard it because everything in the room had gone still inside her body, the way her father taught her to still herself when something felt wrong. Sit straight. Breathe slow. Watch everything. Joanna sat at her desk with her hands folded, palms flat against the smooth wood. Her blue uniform was crisp, her shoes polished, her homework already stacked neatly in the corner of her desk. She had chosen this seat carefully months ago. Third row from the front, close enough to show respect, far enough to stay out of reach. It had always worked. Until today. Margaret Harrison stood at the front of the classroom, posture rigid, lips pressed in. She had arrived earlier than usual that morning, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum as she arranged papers that were already perfectly aligned. Margaret prided herself on order. She believed order was character, that rules made people better, that standards separated those who belonged from those who didn't. Her blazer was immaculate. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun that never shifted, never softened. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, assessing, judging. They stopped on Joanna. The room seemed to shrink. "Miss Thomas," Margaret said, her voice clipped, polished, carrying the practiced authority of someone who expected obedience. "Stand up." Joanna felt every pair of eyes slide toward her. She stood smoothly, chair barely making a sound as she pushed it back. Her heart was beating faster now, but her face remained calm. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, steady and low. Discipline is armor. Don't give them a reaction they're looking for. "Yes, ma'am," Joanna said. Margaret's gaze lingered on her hair. A crown of carefully maintained natural coils, neatly styled, not a strand out of place. Joanna had spent time on it that morning, working patiently, the way her father taught her to do everything, slowly, deliberately, with care. Margaret's mouth tightened. "Your hair," she said, tilting her head slightly, as though inspecting a flaw. "It's inappropriate." A few students shifted in their seats. Someone inhaled sharply. Joanna blinked once. "Ma'am." "It's distracting," Margaret continued, louder now, her tone sharpening. "It violates our grooming standards." Joanna's hands twitched at her sides before she consciously stilled them. She had worn this same style for months. No warnings, no notes sent home, no quiet conversations after class. She had memorized a handbook. Her father made sure of that. With respect, Joanna said carefully, "My hair follows all school guidelines. It's neat and—" "Enough," Margaret snapped, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I will not debate policy with a child." The word child landed heavily, like a door slamming shut. Phones began to appear under desks. Subtle at first. Screens angled low, hands shaking slightly. Students knew when something was wrong. They always did. Margaret took a step closer. Then another. "Sit," she ordered. Joanna sat. Margaret turned sharply toward her desk and yanked open the top drawer. The sound echoed in the too-quiet room. Joanna's stomach tightened as she saw the glint of metal. Scissors. A murmur rippled through the class. Someone whispered she wouldn't. Another voice, soft, frightened, said, "Is she serious?" Margaret lifted the scissors, testing their weight in her hand. "If you insist on bringing attention to yourself," she said coldly, "then I'll resolve the issue myself." "Mrs. Harrison," a boy near the window began, half rising from his seat. "Silence!" Margaret snapped without looking at him. Joanna's breath caught, not in panic, but in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not like this. She thought of her father again, of the way he always looked her in the eye when he spoke, as though the world was something you face head-on, never shrinking. Margaret stepped into Joanna's space. Up close, Joanna could smell her perfume. Sharp, floral, overwhelming. Margaret reached down, her fingers closing around a section of Joanna's hair. Her grip was firm, possessive. The classroom vanished. There was only the pressure on her scalp and the sound of her own heartbeat. Snip! A thick lock of hair fell onto Joanna's open notebook. Gasps erupted. A pencil clattered to the floor. Someone's hand flew to their mouth. Joanna didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't move. Her eyes fixed on the page in front of her, on the strands of hair resting there like something foreign, something stolen. Her jaw tightened, muscles locking into place. She memorized the weight of the moment, the smell of the room, the sound of breathing around her. Every detail pressed itself into her mind. Margaret straightened, satisfaction flickering briefly across her face. "There," she said. "Now you look presentable." The word presentable hummed in the air, ugly and heavy. Phones were no longer hidden. Several students held them openly now, hands trembling as they recorded. Sarah in the front row had tears streaming down her face. Another boy stared at Joanna with wide, horrified eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Joanna slowly lifted her gaze. She looked directly at Margaret. There was no anger in her eyes, no pleading, just something quiet and steady that made Margaret hesitate for half a second longer than she intended. "Go to the office," Margaret said sharply, recovering immediately. Joanna stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor. She gathered her notebook, careful not to disturb the hair resting on it, and tucked it under her arm. For a moment, she considered leaving the hair behind. Then she didn't. She walked to the door with her head held high, every step measured. As she passed the threshold, she felt it, the shift in the air, the way the hallway seemed to hold its breath. And then she saw him. A tall black man stood a few feet away, dressed in a navy suit that looked effortlessly expensive. His posture was relaxed, hands clasped loosely behind his back, as though he were waiting patiently for a meeting to begin. His face was calm, unreadable. His eyes, however, were locked on the classroom behind her, on Margaret Harrison. Joanna paused for half a heartbeat. The man's gaze flicked to her, just briefly. No panic, no shock, only recognition, and something else. Assurance. "I see you." Joanna lowered her eyes and continued down the hall. Behind her, the bell rang. Shrill, ordinary, final. Students stood, chairs scraping. Conversations beginning again in confused murmurs. Margaret smoothed her blazer and returned the scissors to her desk drawer, her pulse still racing. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was policy. She told herself she had done the right thing. What none of them noticed, none of them except the man in the hallway, was the way the room itself seemed to recoil, as though it understood something they did not. Because Margaret Harrison had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed, and the world she was standing on was about to shift. Comment. Should Joanna have fought back, or was silence a smarter move? Like if you felt that moment in your chest. Subscribe, because this was only beginning. The meeting happened less than an hour after Joanna Thomas was escorted out of the building. It wasn't announced over the intercom. There was no emergency bell, no visible panic. On the surface, the school moved the way it always did, smooth, efficient, polished. Children lined up for their next classes. Teachers smiled in the hallways. Lessons continued. But behind closed doors, the machinery was already turning. The principal, Dr. Elaine Whitmore, sat at the head of the long conference table, hands folded neatly over a leather-bound planner. She was a woman known for her composure, her ability to manage situations. Parents admired her calm. Teachers respected her authority. The board praised her discretion. Discretion was her gift. Margaret Harrison sat 2 seats to her right, back straight, chin lifted. The scissors were no longer in her possession. They had been quietly removed from her desk and placed somewhere no one would mention. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, though her fingers were still tingling from adrenaline. Across from them sat the vice principal, the school counselor, and 2 board representatives who had been called in early out of an abundance of caution. No one said the word assault. No one said abuse. Dr. Whitmore cleared her throat. "Let's be very clear," she began, her voice smooth and measured. "What occurred this morning was a misunderstanding." Margaret nodded slightly, as though grateful for the word. "A lapse in communication," the vice principal added quickly, "between teacher and student." "Yes," Dr. Whitmore said, "and as with any misunderstanding, our responsibility is to de-escalate." One of the board members leaned forward. "There were recordings," he said carefully. Dr. Whitmore smiled faintly. "Children record everything these days. Context is often missing." Margaret folded her hands tighter. "I was enforcing policy," she said. "Nothing more." No one asked which policy. No one asked why scissors were involved. Instead, the counselor spoke up. "We should be mindful of how this could be perceived." Perceived. Not what happened. Not what was done. Only how it might look. Dr. Whitmore nodded. "Exactly. Our priority is protecting the integrity of the institution." And just like that, the direction was set. By lunchtime, parents began receiving emails. "Dear valued families, this morning, an incident occurred involving a student and a member of our faculty. We want to assure you that the matter has been addressed internally and poses no ongoing concern. Our school remains committed to maintaining high standards of conduct and appearance to ensure a focused learning environment for all students." The word hair did not appear once. Neither did scissors. Neither did Joanna Thomas. In classrooms, whispers spread like static. "Did you see it? My cousin recorded. They said she broke the rules. She didn't do anything." Some students huddled together during lunch, voices low, eyes darting toward teachers. Others pretended nothing had happened. Laughter a little too loud, movements a little too forced. One girl, a parent's daughter, clutched her phone under the table, staring at the video she had recorded. Her finger hovered over the delete button. Her mother had already called her twice. "You don't want trouble," she had said. "This school has connections." In the hallway near the main office, a teacher leaned against the lockers, watching as Joanna's mother was quietly ushered inside. The teacher opened her mouth, then closed it again. She turned away, heart pounding, telling herself it wasn't her place. That was how the silence grew. Not loudly, not all at once, piece by piece. Joanna sat in a small waiting room, while adults spoke behind frosted glass. Her feet dangled above the floor, shoes swinging slightly. She stared at the pattern in the carpet, tracing it over and over with her eyes. When the door finally opened, Dr. Whitmore knelt in front of her, smile practiced and gentle. "Joanna, sweetie," she said, "we think it's best if you go home for the day." Joanna looked up. "Is Mrs. Harrison going home too?" The smile tightened. "No," Dr. Whitmore said after a beat. "She's continuing her classes." Joanna nodded once. At the end of the day, Margaret Harrison stood in front of her class again. Her voice was steady, her posture confident. "Let's settle down," she said. "We have a lesson to get through." No mention of Joanna. No acknowledgement of what had happened. When the final bell rang, Margaret was congratulated quietly in the staff lounge. "You handled that well," one teacher murmured. "Maintaining control is important," another added. Margaret sipped her coffee, the knot in her chest slowly loosening. Control. Yes, that was the word. At home, Joanna went straight to her room. She placed her notebook on the desk. Carefully, she lifted the lock of hair and laid it beside her textbooks, smoothing it flat with deliberate fingers. She washed her hands. She changed her clothes. She sat down and opened her homework. Down the hall, Klein Thomas stood silently in the doorway, watching his daughter from a distance. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just did her work. The school thought the story was over. They were wrong. Comment: have you ever seen an institution protect the wrong person? Share if this feels uncomfortably familiar. The house was quiet in the way only disciplined homes ever were. Not empty, not cold, just controlled. Joanna Thomas sat at her desk beneath the soft glow of a reading lamp, pencil moving steadily across the page. Math problems first, then spelling, then reading. The routine was familiar, comforting, even. She worked through each assignment with the same careful attention she always gave, pausing only to erase a mistake and rewrite the answer neatly. On the desk, beside her books, lay the lock of hair. She hadn't hidden it. She hadn't thrown it away. She had placed it where she could see it, close enough to acknowledge, far enough not to overwhelm. That, too, was something she had learned at home. Across the hallway, Klein Thomas moved quietly through the kitchen. He set a kettle on the stove, measured tea leaves without looking at the scale, and waited. His movements were unhurried, precise. Every action had intention. Every pause had purpose. He did not rush into his daughter's room. He did not ask questions. He waited. That was Klein Thomas's first rule of power. Observe before you act. Joanna finished her last problem and set her pencil down. Only then did she allow herself to look at the hair again. Her throat tightened. Not enough to cry, not enough to break. Just enough to remind her that something had been taken from her without consent. She thought of her father's voice, calm and unwavering. You don't waste energy reacting to disrespect. You collect information. A soft knock came at the door. Dinner's ready, Klein said. Joanna stood and followed him to the table. They ate quietly, rice, vegetables, grilled fish. Klein asked about her homework. Joanna answered plainly. No mention of school. No mention of Margaret Harrison. Not yet. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like denial. It wasn't. It was discipline. The next morning, the school interpreted Joanna's absence as compliance. She went home. One teacher whispered in the staff room, probably embarrassed. Her parents must have handled it, another said. You know how these things go. Margaret Harrison overheard the conversation and said nothing. She sipped her coffee, eyes forward, her shoulders easing as the minutes passed. The fear she felt the day before, the flicker of uncertainty, was already fading. Nothing had happened. That meant she had been right. At recess, students gathered in tight clusters. Did you hear? They said her parents didn't complain. She must have known she was wrong. A few students disagreed quietly, but voices dropped when teachers walked by. Fear had a way of training children, quickly. Back at the Thomas house, Klein sat in his study long after Joanna had gone back to her room. The walls were lined with books, history, economics, philosophy. Framed photographs hung among them, moments captured with people whose names rarely appeared in headlines but whose influence shaped industries. Klein didn't turn on the main light. He preferred shadows when thinking. He opened his laptop, not to email the school, not to call a lawyer. Instead, he pulled up the school's website, board members, donation records, mission statements, policy documents, archived newsletters. He read slowly, marking inconsistencies, noting language, high standards, tradition, character, words that sounded noble, words that often had other meanings. He remembered something his mentor once told him years ago when he was still learning how power actually moved. Institutions don't collapse because they're evil. They collapse because they're careless. Klein closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. In her room, Joanna lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The day replayed itself in fragments. The sound of scissors, the weight of Margaret's hand, the way the room had frozen. She felt sadness, yes, but beneath it was something steadier. Resolve. She did not want revenge. She wanted acknowledgement. The next day, Joanna returned to school. She walked the front doors with her head held high, hair restyled neatly to conceal the uneven cut. Whispers followed her down the hallway. That's her. She came back. Doesn't she feel ashamed? Joanna did not slow her pace. In Margaret Harrison's class, a chair sat empty where Joanna's had been. Margaret glanced at it once, then began the lesson without comment. When Joanna entered late, escorted by a staff member, Margaret's eyes flickered with irritation. "Take your seat," she said coolly. Joanna did. Nothing else happened. And that, to the school, was proof enough. They mistook restraint for defeat. They mistook silence for surrender. They did not understand the second rule of power Klein Thomas lived by. Silence is leverage. That evening, Klein finally spoke. They sat at the table again, tea steaming gently between them. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Joanna did. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She described facts, words, actions, timing, the position of the scissors, the presence of phones, the absence of intervention. Klein listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Who was in the hallway?" Joanna thought. "You." Klein nodded. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in calculation. Then he asked a question that would change everything. "Who benefits from this?" Joanna frowned slightly, unsure how to answer. Klein's gaze drifted to window, to the city lights beyond. "That's the question," he said softly. "And once you answer it, everything else becomes very clear." Somewhere across town, Margaret Harrison slept soundly, convinced the matter was over. She had no idea that a single question, asked quietly, without rage, had just been set in motion. And that question would cost several people their careers. Comment. Is silence strength, or surrender, like a Joanna's restraint scared you more than anger would have? Power rarely announces itself. It doesn't kick down doors or raise its voice. It doesn't posture. Real power studies a room, memorizes the exits, and waits until everyone else has mistaken calm for weakness. Klein Thomas understood that better than most. On the surface, nothing had changed. Joanna went to school. Klein went to work. The house remained quiet, orderly, disciplined. No reporters camped outside the gate. No lawyers called with urgent tones. No angry emails were sent to the school demanding accountability. That absence of noise was deliberate. Klein's private office occupied the top floor of a glass building that didn't carry his name. Most people didn't know it belonged to him. That anonymity was intentional, too. The less attention you drew, the more clearly you could see who moved when they thought no one was watching. He sat at his desk late into the evening, screens glowing softly in the dim light. On one screen, a spreadsheet of donor contributions to Joanna's school over the last decade. On another, archived newsletters and policy revisions. On a third, email chains pulled from public record requests and quiet favors owed. Klein didn't skim. He read every line. The school's grooming policy had been revised 3 times in 5 years. Each revision used broader language, less specificity, more administrative discretion. Phrases like "at the teacher's judgment" and "in alignment with institutional standards" appeared where clear rules once stood. Discretion, Klein knew, was where abuse hid best. He leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. This wasn't about one teacher anymore. It never had been. Margaret Harrison was merely a symptom, someone emboldened by a system that rewarded control and punished resistance. The system was the real subject. Across the city, phones buzzed. A board member glanced at an email notification during dinner and frowned. It was from a longtime donor, one of the school's most reliable contributors. "We'll be pausing all future funding pending internal review." No accusations, no explanations, just a pause. Another board member received a similar message an hour later. Then another, different donors. Same language, pausing. At the school's administrative office, Dr. Elaine Whitmore felt the first ripple of unease when her assistant knocked on her door earlier than usual the next morning. Several donors have requested meetings. The assistant said carefully, "They're concerned." "Concerned about what?" Dr. Whitmore asked. The assistant hesitated. They didn't say. That unsettled her more than any complaint would have. Meanwhile, Margaret Harrison stood in her classroom, writing notes on the board, her confidence intact. She had noticed a shift in atmosphere, the way administrators whispered more, the way Dr. Whitmore's smile seemed tighter, but she assumed it was unrelated. Schools were always managing something. She had done nothing wrong. She had enforced standards. That belief steadied her, until the janitor was fired. His name was Mr. Alvarez. He had worked at the school for 12 years. Quiet, reliable, invisible in the way staff like him often were. He had been cleaning the hallway that morning, the hallway outside Margaret's classroom, when he noticed a security camera blinking red. Recording. He hadn't planned to do anything heroic. He hadn't even thought of it that way. He had simply copied the footage before it looped over itself, a habit he developed after seeing too many things quietly disappear. 2 days later, he was called into the office and informed that his position was being eliminated due to budget restructuring. No warning, no discussion. He packed his things in silence. What the administration didn't know was that the footage was already gone from their system, and it was no longer just his. Klein watched the video alone in his office. He didn't flinch. The footage showed Margaret entering the classroom before the bell rang. The students weren't seated yet. Joanna sat calmly at her desk. Margaret approached, not to speak, not to warn, but with scissors already in her hand. There was no conversation, no policy explanation, no attempt at correction, just intent. Klein paused the video at the exact moment Margaret's hand closed around Joanna's hair. He felt something then, not rage, not the hot, blinding anger people expected from men like him when their children were harmed, but something colder, more focused, certainty. This wasn't about interpretation anymore. It was about evidence. He closed the file and made his first call, then his second, then his third. None of them were to journalists. None were to lawyers. He reached out to people who understood leverage, media executives who owed him favors, nonprofit directors whose budgets he had saved, board members who sat on more committees than they could count. He asked questions. Have you heard anything about the school lately? Strange donor activity, isn't it? Interesting policies they have. The questions spread faster than accusations ever could. At the school, panic began to surface, not publicly, but privately. An emergency board meeting was scheduled. Dr. Whitmore sat at the table again, this time with tension etched into her posture. Reports were passed around. Funding projections were revised. The words temporary shortfall and reputational risk appeared in bold. What's causing this? One board member demanded. No one answered, because no one knew where to point the finger. Margaret Harrison wasn't invited to that meeting. She noticed the change anyway. Teachers stopped congratulating her. Administrators avoided her eyes. Dr. Whitmore asked her to document classroom procedures in a way that felt unusually formal. Still, no one mentioned Joanna Thomas. The name hovered just outside every conversation, unspoken but heavy. That night, Klein Thomas received a call. The number wasn't saved in his phone, but he recognized it instantly. He stepped out onto the balcony of his office, city lights stretching below him like a constellation of possibilities. They're asking questions, the voice on the other end said. Calm, familiar. Someone who moved in rooms Klein rarely needed to enter anymore. Good, Klein replied. They don't know it's you yet. Klein smiled faintly. Of course they don't. There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again, lower this time. But they're about to. Klein ended the call and stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the railing. Somewhere below, traffic moved, people hurried, unaware that a small, quiet war had begun, one that wouldn't be fought with headlines or threats, but with timing and truth. Back at home, Joanna slept peacefully for the first time since the incident. She didn't know the details. She didn't need to. She trusted her father, and that trust was well placed, because the school had believed they were dealing with a compliant family. They had believed silence meant surrender. They had believed power looked loud. They were wrong, and very soon they were going to learn exactly who Klein Thomas was. Comment. Should Klein go public or keep playing quietly? Subscribe. This is where power starts moving. The first warning arrived quietly. No envelope, no signature, no threat written in bold letters the way movies like to imagine it. Just a message. It appeared in Klein Thomas's inbox late one evening, sandwiched between routine updates and meeting reminders. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Friendly advice. The body contained only 2 sentences. Some situations are better resolved privately. Protecting your child sometimes means knowing when to stop. Klein stared at the screen for a long moment, the faint hum of the office filling the silence. He didn't delete the message. He didn't respond. He archived it. Across town, Joanna sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through her phone. Group chats she used belonged had gone quiet. A few classmates had removed her entirely. Others posted vague messages, laughing emojis, inside jokes she wasn't part of anymore. At school the next day, no one said her name out loud. They didn't have to. She felt it in the way conversation stopped when she approached, in the way desks shifted slightly farther from hers, in the way teachers no longer called on her, even when her hand was raised. It was subtle, clean, plausibly deniable, exactly how institutions prefer to operate. In the faculty lounge, Margaret Harrison listened as administrators spoke in lowered voices. "There's attention," one said. "Unnecessary attention," another replied. Margaret sipped her tea and said nothing. She felt it too now. The shift, the tightening air, the sense that something was moving just out of sight. Still, no one confronted her. No one accused her. And as long as that remained true, she told herself she was safe. After all, the system was on her side, or so she believed. Klein's lawyer withdrew 3 days later. No phone call, no meeting, just a brief email sent at 6:12 p.m. After careful consideration, "I've decided to step away from this matter. I believe it would be best for you to seek alternative counsel." That was it. No explanation, no apology. Klein read the message twice, then closed his laptop slowly. He leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. This was escalation. Lawyers didn't walk away from cases like this unless someone had made it very uncomfortable for them to stay. At school, the retaliation sharpened. A girl, accidentally, spilled juice on Joanna's desk. Another laughed when Joanna's books fell from her locker, scattering across the floor. No one helped her pick them up. A teacher witnessed it and turned away. Joanna collected her things in silence, her movements steady, controlled. Inside, something heavy pressed against her ribs. Not panic, not anger, loneliness. At lunch, she sat alone. Across the cafeteria, students glanced at her and then quickly looked away. Fear was contagious. So was silence. That afternoon, Joanna came home earlier than usual. She didn't go to her room. She went straight to the kitchen, where Klein stood reading on his tablet. "Dad," she said quietly. He looked up at once. "Yes." She hesitated, fingers curling slightly at her sides. "They don't talk to me anymore." Klein set the tablet down. "How long has this been happening?" Joanna shrugged. "A few days." He waited. He always waited. "They say I'm causing problems," she added. "That I should have just let it go." Klein's jaw tightened, just barely. He reached for the kettle, poured tea into 2 cups, and slid one toward her. "Sit," he said gently. She did. He watched her for a moment. Really watched her. The way her shoulders stayed squared. The way her chin lifted, even when her eyes flickered with hurt. She looked older than she had a week ago. That was when the second message arrived. This one came to his phone. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Klein didn't show it to her. Instead, he asked, "What do you think letting it go would look like?" Joanna considered the question, pretending it didn't matter. "And did it matter?" "Yes," she said immediately. Then softer, "It still does." That evening, the Thomas household received its first anonymous call. The line crackled. No voice, just breathing. Then the call disconnected. Joanna froze, phone still in her hand. Klein took it gently from her. "That's enough for today," he said calmly. But inside, something had shifted. This was no longer about reputation. This was pressure. At school the following day, Margaret Harrison noticed Joanna's isolation and felt an unexpected flicker of satisfaction. Control restored. She thought, order reestablished. She was wrong, because isolation cuts both ways. Joanna stopped raising her hand, stopped correcting mistakes, stopped trying to be seen. Her silence, once misread as compliance, had become something else entirely, a quiet indictment that made teachers uncomfortable. It reminded them of what they were ignoring. Some avoided her out of guilt, others out of fear. That afternoon, Klein met with a different attorney, one recommended by someone who owed Klein more than money. The attorney listened carefully, nodding along, then sighed. "You're pushing against something bigger than a single school," he said. "This could get complicated." Klein met his gaze. "Complicated doesn't scare me." The attorney hesitated. "It should." They parted without an agreement. That night, Joanna stood in the doorway of her father's study. "Dad!" He turned. "Yes." She stepped inside, eyes downcast. "I don't want you to stop because of me." Klein frowned slightly. "What makes you think I would?" She swallowed. "Because it's getting harder." The words landed heavily between them. Klein rose from his chair and knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her level. "Look at me," he said softly. She did. "You are not the problem," he said, "and you will never be the price of justice." Joanna nodded, but then something inside her cracked just enough to let the truth out. "I just wanted someone to say it was wrong," she whispered. "I didn't want everything to feel like my fault." That was the moment, not the threats, not the pressure, not the lawyer walking away. That was when Klein Thomas realized the cost was no longer theoretical. It had a face, and it was his daughter's. That night, after Joanna had gone to bed, Klein sat alone in the darkened living room. He reviewed the messages again, the pauses, the silence, the calculated intimidation. He exhaled slowly. Waiting had served its purpose. Silence had done its work. But there was a point when restraint stopped being strategy and became permission. And Klein Thomas had no intention of giving permission. That night, Klein stopped waiting. Comment. Would you keep pushing or protect your child at all costs? Share if this part hit too close to home. The truth did not arrive with a warning. It didn't knock politely or ask permission. It didn't announce itself with outrage or spectacle. It arrived the way all dangerous truths do. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. It began with a question, not an accusation, not a headline. A question. A respected education reporter posted a short thread late on a Tuesday evening, long after the school day had ended and administrators had gone home. Has anyone else heard about the incident involving a student at Whitmore Preparatory School last week? No names, no details, just enough. Within minutes, replies began to appear. Parents, alumni, former staff, a few anonymous accounts posting vague but pointed comments. I heard something happen in a classroom. There was a video. The school asked people to delete it. Klein Thomas read the thread without expression. He didn't like chaos. He preferred control. But chaos, he understood, had its uses, especially when exposed cracks that power worked hard to hide. He didn't respond. He forwarded the thread to 3 people. That was all. By morning, journalists were asking better questions. Not, did something happen? But why is no one talking about it? The school's communications office issued a brief statement before lunch. We are aware of online speculation regarding an internal matter. We take all concerns seriously and are reviewing the situation in accordance with our established procedures. Established procedures. Those words had carried them far for years. This time, they weren't enough. The video surfaced that afternoon. It didn't appear on the school's channels. It wasn't leaked to tabloids. It didn't carry dramatic music or captions. It was posted plainly, without commentary, by an account that had never shared anything political before. 38 seconds. That was all it took. The footage showed Margaret Harrison entering the classroom before the bell, scissors already in her hand. Joanna seated calmly at her desk. No conversation. No warning. No policy cited. Just action. By the end of the clip, The room was frozen in collective disbelief. By the end of the hour, the video had been downloaded, reposted, mirrored, and saved more times than the school could count. The silence they had carefully manufactured shattered. News outlets didn't rush to condemn. They did something far more dangerous. They asked questions. Was this disciplinary action? Is this consistent with school policy? Why was the student sent home instead of the teacher? Why was the footage allegedly deleted? Each question peeled back a layer. Board members' phones lit up with calls from reporters who knew how to sound neutral while pressing for answers. Lawyers requested meetings. Donors requested explanations. And somewhere deep in the administrative wing, Dr. Elaine Whitmore felt the ground give way beneath her feet. An emergency board meeting was convened within hours. This time, the tone was different. No euphemisms, and gentle phrasing that no reassurances. The room buzzed with tension as printed screenshots of the video were passed around like evidence at a crime scene. "This looks bad," one board member said flatly. "It is bad," another replied. "And we don't control the narrative anymore." Dr. Whitmore tried to steady the conversation. "We need to remain calm," she said. "We can frame this as an isolated incident." A lawyer cut her off. "You can't frame video," he said. "It frames you." The word subpoena entered the discussion shortly after. Margaret Harrison was not invited to the meeting. She found out what was happening the same way everyone else did, on her phone. She sat at her kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched beside her, scrolling in disbelief as the video played again and again across her screen. Comments flooded in beneath it. Some outraged, some stunned, some simply asking how something like this could happen in a modern school. She searched for her name. It was everywhere. Her hands began to shake. By midday, she received the call. "Margaret," Dr. Whitmore said, her voice clipped and unfamiliar. "We're placing you on administrative leave effective immediately." Margaret's mouth went dry. "This is outrageous," she said. "I followed procedure." "We'll be conducting a full review," Dr. Whitmore replied. "For now, it's best you step away." Step away. The phrase echoed hollowly. By the time the call ended, the school had already released a new statement. "We do not condone the actions depicted in the circulating footage. The individual involved has been placed on leave pending investigation. We remain committed to fostering a respectful and inclusive environment. The individual involved." No mention of encouragement, that no mention of prior praise, that no acknowledgement of silence. The institution was distancing itself. Fast. At home, Joanna watched the news quietly from a couch. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She simply watched. Clips played on screen, analysts discussing power dynamics, educators debating disciplinary boundaries, parents expressing shock. Some called the incident disturbing. Others called it systemic. Joanna didn't feel triumphant. She felt lighter. Klein sat beside her, his presence steady, grounding. He didn't explain. He didn't narrate. He didn't take credit. He just sat. At school, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Teachers spoke in hushed tones. Students whispered openly now, fear replaced by curiosity. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at Joanna with something new. Respect, maybe, or guilt. The principal announced a temporary review of disciplinary practices. The janitor's firing came under scrutiny. Board members received formal notices requesting documentation. The system that had once closed ranks was now scrambling to protect itself. Margaret Harrison watched it all unravel from her living room. Colleagues stopped returning her messages. Friends advised her to stay offline. The school she had believed would shield her had already moved on. She replayed the video again, watching herself through the lens of the world. She saw it now, the moment she hadn't noticed before. The stillness in Joanna's eyes, the lack of resistance, the quiet certainty. It terrified her, because it meant the child had known something Margaret hadn't, that this wasn't over. And it never had been. Late that evening, as the footage continued to circulate and the headlines grew sharper, Margaret sat alone in the dark. The silence she once controlled, the silence she enforced, relied on, wielded, had turned against her. It no longer protected her. It swallowed her whole. like if truth felt satisfying here. Comment: was this justice or just beginning? Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it leaves without a sound. Margaret Harrison's removal did not come with handcuffs or headlines. There was no public apology tour, no dramatic firing, no final speech about misunderstood intentions. Her name simply disappeared from the school's website one morning. Her classroom was reassigned. Her office door emptied. A single line appeared in an internal memo. Ms. Harrison is no longer employed by Whitmore Preparatory School. No explanation. No defense. No ceremony. For years, Margaret had believed power meant being untouchable, being backed by policy, protected by hierarchy, shielded by silence. She had mistaken authority for permanence. She learned, too late, that systems don't defend people. They defend themselves. And when a person becomes inconvenient, the system lets them go without hesitation. Whitmore Preparatory moved quickly after that, not because of remorse, but because of survival. Consultants were hired. Committees were formed. New language appeared everywhere. Equity audits, disciplinary transparency, student dignity protocols. Mandatory trainings were scheduled. A revised code of conduct was sent home to parents, thick with reassurances and carefully chosen words. The board issued a public commitment to reform. Donors returned, slowly. The institution stabilized, but it was no longer the same. The illusion of moral superiority had cracked, and everyone could see the fracture. Joanna returned to school 3 weeks later. No announcement marked her arrival. No assembly. No apology delivered in front of her peers. Just a quiet walk through familiar hallways that now felt subtly altered. People noticed her. Some looked away, ashamed. Some nodded, uncertain how to act. A few smiled, small and genuine. She took her seat in a different classroom, at a different desk. Her hair had grown just enough to soften the sharpness of memory, but not enough to erase it. She did not carry herself like a victor. She carried herself like someone who had learned something irreversible. The teachers were careful around her now. Too careful. Voices softened. Rules explained twice. Discipline handled delicately, as if everyone feared becoming the next headline. Joanna observed it all quietly. She had learned the system's weakness, and she had learned her own strength. At home, nothing changed. Klein still woke early, still read in silence, still asked questions instead of giving instructions. He never once said, "I told you so." He never framed what happened as a win. When friends hinted at admiration, when acquaintances tried to praise his restraint or speculate about his influence, Klein shut the conversation down with a simple response. It wasn't about me, and it wasn't. The case didn't end in court. IT didn't need to. The exposure had already done the work litigation was meant to do. Careers were redirected. Policies rewritten. Quiet settlements signed with language so dense it could barely be understood, but clear enough to signal accountability. The janitor was rehired, quietly, with compensation, and a letter of recommendation that spoke volumes without naming names. Students began recording less, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't feel powerless anymore. The air changed. Months later, at a small end-of-year gathering, Dr. Whitmore gave a speech about learning moments and growth through accountability. She never mentioned Joanna by name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. Joanna stood at the edge of the room, listening without reacting. Klein stood near the door, as he always did, watching, not participating. When the applause ended, nothing dramatic followed. No confrontation. No reconciliation scene. No final showdown. Just life continuing, slightly corrected. That was the real reckoning. Margaret Harrison moved on to a smaller school in another district. Her reputation permanently altered. She avoided discussions about Whitmore, avoided questions, avoided reflections. Silence, once her weapon, became her shelter. Joanna graduated quietly years later. No one cut her hair again. But more importantly, no one ever mistook her silence for weakness again. She learned early what many never learn at all. That power does not shout. That dignity does not beg. That systems collapse not from attack, but from exposure. Klein watched her step forward into her future with the same calm he had always carried. No pride on display, no satisfaction taken, because real power, he knew, is not about being seen winning. It is about knowing you never had to raise your voice to change the outcome. Joanna never raised her voice. Klein never made a threat. And yet, everything changed. Comment, what part of this story stayed with you? Subscribe for tomorrow's story, because silence has consequences.